All right, thank you everybody for making it back from the break. I do appreciate all the networking that was happening, but I do appreciate you coming back so that we can go on to our next piece, which is we're really excited to welcome Ben Francisco Malbec to Cleveland. He flew in from New York. It was a little concerning for a minute. A flight did get canceled, but Ben was like, I need to make it to Cleveland, so whatever you need to do. And I don't know if he got here in covered wagon or what happened, but he made it happen, so we really appreciate that. So Ben is the president of Funders for LGBTQ Issues, a national organization, and what I'm happy to learn about Ben is that he has experience that is from both sides of the table. So he's not just always been in the philanthropy world. He did work for the Philadelphia Foundation, but he also worked for the William Way LGBT Community Center. And I really appreciate that he's going to be able to talk to us and come from a perspective of really understanding both sides of philanthropy and also nonprofits that are working in the community. So he's going to talk to us a little bit about the impact of philanthropy nationally as well as locally. So if we can welcome Ben.
Hey everybody. Is the mic working? Great. So I am excited to be here. I didn't even have to take a wagon, but I did have a couple of flight switcheroos, but it all worked out. And I'm thrilled to be here with you today, especially with such an amazing roster of speakers. So I'm actually going to talk about two things. Oh, is this working? Oh, there we go. But first I'll just tell you the 2-minute version of what Funders for LGBTQ Issues is. We are a national network of funders who are committed to strengthening LGBTQ communities. So we're a network of members. We have members who are funders that you might know that focus primarily on LGBT issues, such as, I'm off my mark. Okay, great. Behind them, okay, got it. Thank you. Sorry about that for those viewing on camera. I guess you were looking at nothing for a little bit. We include funders like the Arcus Foundation or the Gill Foundation that really are focused on LGBT communities as their primary funding area, and then also other funders like the Ford Foundation or community foundations across the country that have integrated LGBT issues and LGBT communities into the larger grant-making work that they do. And we do convenings like this. We try to raise awareness about LGBT philanthropic issues. We do lots of research, which you'll hear some of. And then we also try to expand and reach out to new funders to help connect their missions with the various things going on in LGBT communities. So I'm actually going to have two things. I'm going to do just a little bit of data about LGBT demographics, just so you know those basic background, both in the US and in Ohio. And then I'm going to give you the data on LGBT funding, both in the US and in Ohio. So how many people here are data geeks? Data geeks, raise your hand. Okay, great. You are going to love this portion of the program. The rest of you are also going to love it because I'm going to fill this with hilarious LGBT funding humor that is going to just knock your socks off. So, all right, so wait, before I get to the actual numbers on the population, it actually is pretty hard to figure out some LGBT statistics for a couple of reasons, which you might be able to guess. One is we're a relatively small population. So anytime you're looking at a small population, it's hard, for those of you who are data geeks, it's hard to get a good sample size that gives you really reliable data. The second thing is we're hard to find because it's not immediately obvious who is LGBT, and people don't necessarily walk up to you and say, hi, I'm gay. It's not listed, it doesn't say in the phone book. Remember when we had phone books? It doesn't necessarily say, X person is gay, so that makes it hard to do random surveys. So recently, the data geeks, the sub-community of the LGBT community of data geeks was very excited last year when the Williams Institute and Gallup solved this problem by getting, or at least one of the problems, by getting a huge sample size. What they did is every week that Gallup does, every day Gallup does like 1,000 or something surveys. And so for a few months, they added one question, which is, do you identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender? And as a result, they got a sample size of more than 100,000 people answering that question, which is something that we have never had before. So there was much celebrating in the LGBT data geek community, and we found this out, which is that there are at least 8.4 million LGBT people in the United States. And we are about 3.5% of the adult population. Now, almost always when I present to this, the first thing people say is, what, that seems really low. So there are two things to know about that. One is, this is the people, remember, who said yes to the question, do you identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, to a random person calling them on the phone. So, and we all of us who have been LGBT, there were also other questions like, what's your racial background, what's your, other personal questions. But this was in there. And so not necessarily everyone is going to see us. So this is only the out population that we're capturing, and the full same-sex behaving LGBT population is actually much larger than that. And that is important to remember too, because other studies that we've done have found that actually people who are not out are in fact more likely to be vulnerable on a whole bunch of things, including, in particular, a lot of health and mental health outcomes. So this doesn't capture everything, but it is a pretty good data set. So the most important thing, the other thing, and this also affects the overall numbers, that drives LGBT demographics is actually age. So you can see here, if you're over 65, you're less than 2% of the population identifies as LGBT, whereas if you are between the ages of 18 and 29, 6.4%, 3 times as many people identify as LGBT among that younger population than among the older population. This is not a great mystery, I don't think. This is simply because we've become more accepting, so younger folks are more likely to be out and to identify compared to older folks. That is not to say there isn't need among LGBT older adults, as Phyllis was talking about, and as you'll hear more about later. And in fact, there is great need because there may be just as large a population, but it is not as out. And so, so there still is a significant need across the board. But this fact of how the LGBT population is distributed across age drives a lot of the other statistics that I'm about to show you, which includes this one, which is that there's actually a slightly larger proportion of communities of color identify as LGBT than do white folks. And that goes counter to the stereotype which I don't even know where this came from, but this idea that gay people are mostly gay white men is clearly not true, as you can see on this slide. And this is mostly because young people are more likely to identify as LGBT, and what else are young people more likely to be? They're more likely to be people of color. So when you combine those two things, you end up with a chart that looks like this. And then similarly, we see the same demographics with income, where LGBT people are more likely to fall on the lower brackets. As you can see, 5% of those making under $25,000 identify as LGBT, compared to 2.8% of those making more than $90,000. And some of that is about the age gap again, because young people tend to be making less money, both because you earn less when you're younger and also because there's actually greater poverty in this generation that's coming up, unfortunately. And then there are also other factors in here, such as, I would say, employment discrimination, all of the things that you've been hearing about today that make it more likely that LGBT people, unfortunately, earn less money. On average, I should say. And then let's look a little bit at Ohio. And just so you see, so in terms of, the Gallup data actually gave us an LGBT percentage for each state. Oh, no, I'm out of my camp, I'm sorry. I'm a wanderer, I'm terrible. I can never do a TED Talk. It'll be like a blank screen and someone talking with slides. So Ohio is actually right in the middle in terms of its LGBT population. It's about 3.6%. It's completely on the dot average. It may be off by 0.1%, which is statistically not significant. And then in terms of the breakdown, we know there are about 328,000 people in this state who identify or out as LGBT to a random person on the phone, probably even more than that when you look at the larger population. And 212,000 of those people are in the workforce. So in terms of the employment discrimination issues that Elizabeth was talking about, that's 212,000 people who are still vulnerable in this state and who can be fired for their sexual orientation or gender identity at any time. So it's a pretty significant issue affecting a significant population. And then there are about 20,000 same-sex couples according to the latest US Census. And you'll see that number is much lower and has always been much lower. Some of that may be because it seems like LGBT people, at least so far, are less likely to be in couples. That may change as marriage equality comes to us. And it also is partly driven by the age thing, where you have folks who are, since our population does tend to be younger overall, then they are not yet coupled. I think we'll see that number going up quite a bit in the decades to come. So now we're going to look at the funding picture. How much funding is going to LGBT issues across the US and in Ohio? And I should say for clarity, I'm just talking about foundation funding. What my organization is really focused on is what foundations are supporting through their grants. So that's actually a small slice of the pie. About $50 billion a year is given out by foundations. That compares to $300 billion that is given out total in charitable donations. So by far the much larger portion actually comes from individual donors. Those of you who run nonprofits or work in nonprofits hopefully know this, and your fundraising efforts are focused on individual donors, not just chasing us foundation people. But it is an important piece of the pie, and that is what we will be, and it's also much easier to track, frankly, than the individual donors, and that's what we'll be talking about today. So here is what I think is the good news. LGBT funding is growing incredibly fast, and in fact, exponentially. We have gone from, first you can see in 1973, in the 70s, we were pretty much at zero. Went up in the 80s during the HIV epidemic, in fact, was when we were founded and our sister organization Funders Concerned About AIDS was founded, and there was a growing awareness in the funding community that we need to start paying attention to this community. And then in particular, in the 90s and in the O's, it really took off. And just in the past 10 years, we've gone from about $30 million a year in foundation funding for LGBT issue to more than $120 million. So we've quadrupled in just a decade. And there are really two things driving this. One is gays and lesbians, mainly, some bisexual and trans, but mostly gays and lesbians at this point, founded private foundations. So LGBT people of wealth founded private foundations, and then as part of the causes of those foundations, they identified LGBT issues and have been giving significantly. And about half of the funding for LGBT issues in every given year comes from private foundations or community foundations founded by and for LGBT communities. And then the other trend that's reflected here is that more and more foundations working in a range of issues, whether it's social justice broadly or health, have recognized that if they want to have an impact in their funding, they need to be looking at how LGBT communities are affected by their issue of interest. So those are two positive trends that have led to this fast rising chart. On the other hand, it's still pretty small. So the total is $125 million. Remember I said 50 billion? So 125 million divided by 50 billion is 0.25%, 25 cents. So that little dollar there in the corner represents the 25 cents going to LGBT communities, and the other $99.75 is going elsewhere, many of it to really good causes. But when you think about what $100 can do and what 25 cents can do, there's a can 25 cents do anything anymore? Not, I mean, in New York, it can't do anything. Maybe in Cleveland, you can get a bottle cap for it. I don't know. So we still have a long way to go, is what this slide says to me. So I want to just look a little bit at LGBT funding by region and start to slowly zoom in toward Ohio. So as you can see here, this is a breakdown of foundation funding by region. You see those two bigger pink, they're all pink, but the two bigger ones are the Northeast and the West, which is, you're probably not shocked by that, right? And then the middle one there, that's sort of medium sized, but still kind of small, is the Midwest, and the sliver there is the South. So you might think, well, how does this compare to the population? It does not really compare very well, because in fact, the Northeast and the West are actually relatively smaller on the population, and particularly the Northeast is only 1/5, whereas the South is almost more than 1/3, and the Midwest is 23%. So what this says is basically the South is really underfunded, and the Midwest is pretty underfunded too, compared to the Northeast and the West Coast. And this is not an LGBT funding issue, this is a general funding issue, where there's a thing of the West Coast and the Northeast, especially DC, New York, California, tend to get more funding, especially for progressive, any sort of policy issue and such that connect it all to progressive causes. So we've also taken this and we said, so what if, let's look at this sort of on a per capita basis. Like, let's look at the level of funding compared to the LGBT population of a given region or state. We call this the GDQ, the grant dollars per queer. So as you can see, the US has a GDQ of $5.78. The South is really, unfortunately, dismally low at $1.71, which we've been working on. And then the Midwest and the Mountain States are sort of in the middle at $4 and change. And then the Northeast and the Pacific are at $9, $10 each, which is not to say that those are overfunded, because again, we're looking here at this, a whole picture of 125 million for a community of 8 million people. The whole community, I would say, is underfunded. But in terms of looking at where are issues where we as a community of funders should be paying a particular attention, I would say we need to be looking a lot more at the South, the Mountain States, and the Midwest. So you're probably wondering now, what about Ohio? Ohio, unfortunately, is not very high up on the GDQ scale. Total funding for Ohio in 2012 was $245,000, and when you divide that by the 300-something thousand LGBT folks in the state, it's only 77 cents per queer, 77 cents GDQ. So that's on the lower end, and it actually is very similar, unfortunately, to some of the southern states. You see, the trend is the southern states, and then a bit in here, especially the lower populated states. But Ohio is pretty low, especially for a pretty well-populated state. So that is a concern that hopefully all of us here will be addressing in our work in various ways. Looking at how funding for Ohio has changed when it comes to LGBT communities, the trend has mostly been upward. It's been a little bit up and down, as you can see. That's mostly because of national funding. Going for, particularly for policy campaigns and initiatives, which tends to be more short-term and not as consistent as local funding is. So that's led to some of these ups and downs, but overall the trend, I would say, has been upward. And now these are some of the top funders of LGBTQ issues in Ohio. I can share this with the Foundation Center and send it out to, is that doable, David? Because I see some people taking notes. Feel free to take notes. I always do because it helps me pay attention, but we can also send these out to you. So as you can see, there's a good mix of both national and local funders. We have the State Equality Fund at the Tides Foundation has supported Equality Ohio and other organizations working to advance policy issues for LGBT equality. Columbus Foundation is a local funder that has provided a lot of support. I should note that the Cleveland Foundation, with its grant to the Gay Games this year, will be moving way up the list after 2013. This only counts the data from, foundation funding data tends to lag by like a year or two, so we have up through 2012 in this. So it's not completely as up to date as it could be. Or it is as up to date as it could be, but it's not, it's still a good year or so old. And then so you see a good mix of both national and local, family foundations and others. A lot of folks have invested in this state. And then to give you the exact breakdown of national versus Ohio, we see about 64% of funding coming from national funders, mostly from national LGBT funders, and 36% of funding coming from foundations based right here in Ohio. And that's a pretty good mix. Sometimes we see it where it's almost all national or almost all local. So it's good to see that there is some mix, and I think that even though the overall GDQ is low, the fact that there are at least a good mix of funders here and committed to investing in the state, I think offers a lot of potential for growing the overall pie. And then these are the top LGBT grantees, so you know. Equality Ohio really stands out. But again, there's an interesting mix. Sometimes in some states, you'll see it's almost all policy or it's almost all service. This one we have a good mix of, you know, in addition to Equality Ohio, we have several of the community centers and HIV service organizations, some faith-based organizations. It's a pretty good and healthy mix and a pretty vibrant sector overall. So in terms of where you see things falling by issue, civil rights and advocacy is getting the largest chunk at 29%. That's as it is across the country. In fact, it's a little bit lower than average. Often it's 43% of funding is going to civil rights. That's very unusual. In the foundation world, most funding tends to go towards services. But when you have a community that does not have basic rights, it's not surprising that there should be funding to get some of those basic rights. But there is an interesting dynamic that goes on that might be fruitful for us all to be thinking about, which is that so the national LGBT funders tend to invest in civil rights. And most of that piece of the pie is coming from national LGBT funders. And then local funders tend to invest more in services, community centers, and such. So that's a divide that I'm actually hoping and starting to see break down a little bit, where I'm seeing local funders more and more stepping up to support the advocacy for basic rights that LGBT communities need. And I'm also seeing national funders interested in social change issues recognize that you can't just, once you change a law, that is not, the work is not done, and we need to look more broadly about how do we really change the lived experience of LGBT people, and that requires a whole vibrant sector that is looking at how do we make schools safer for amazing students like Max, how do we make sure that folks can go to a community center and get access to basic services to make sure that we are able to age through the span of our life and be comfortable and safe. We really need to look at that whole big picture. So, and I think more and more the funding community is starting to think in that way, in a holistic and intersectional way about how do we really change people's lives. That was a long but important side note. So then we also have community building support and services at 27%. That's about average for the nation. And then there are a couple of things that stand out as interesting, I think, in Ohio, and maybe say something about the local philanthropic culture, which is investment in faith-based community building in LGBT communities is actually higher than in most places. It's at 10% here. Across the country, it's usually like 2%. So it's actually a much larger piece of the pie. And then arts, culture, and media is also high. It's usually around 5% for the nation, and here it's 9%. So that was interesting to me that those are two things that are getting a little more investment and perhaps reflect something about the state. And the last thing I will share with you is just to look at the map of Ohio and where funding is going in the state. So these dark areas show the areas where there's greater investment. As you can see, most of the state is white, which means no LGBT grants have gone specifically to an organization based in that area. That doesn't mean that no funding has reached there. The work that Equality Ohio does, for example, affects the entire state, and they have offices throughout the state, but are based in Columbus, so that's where that shows up. But regardless of that, this does reflect a challenge that I'm seeing across the country, and not just in LGBT communities, but so many of the resources are based in the urban centers. And how do we reach LGBT folks who are not living in Columbus or in Cleveland to make sure that we really are? And it may not be that, we can't necessarily start an LGBT community center in every county, but there may be, maybe, Phyllis is ready. Outposts all across the state. But there may be ways to build on, say, the great community center you have here in Cleveland and to have outreach. There's all sorts of things you can do, and I think that's an important challenge for funders and nonprofit leaders to be thinking about. So lastly, I just want to leave you with some resources. So this last map you saw here is actually from Philanthropy Insight LGBTQ. That's an interactive map that we have in collaboration with the Foundation Center. It's a pretty amazing tool. You can zoom in on this. If you want to go and look at every grant made in Columbus, you can see that. So it's a really useful tool for funders who want to get a sense of where gaps are, and not for grant seekers who want to get a sense of who has funded what where. You can search by issue, but it's a pretty awesome tool. And I didn't really make it or anything. And it actually was already in place when I started as executive director. I was like, we have this? This is really amazing. We should tell more people about it. And then we also have a whole bunch of reports. One is our 2012 tracking report. All the data I've shown you is from that, plus the reports we've been doing for the past 10 years. We have some of those outside, and you can also download them from our website. And then the 40 years of LGBTQ funding is another one that really gives a nice sense of the history of how LGBT funding has changed and grown over time, and what some of the some of the big impacts have been, and also what some of the potential challenges and opportunities are for the future. And a whole bunch of other stuff. And it's all lgbtfunders.org. It's a very easy URL to remember. And that's all I've got, I think. Yeah. So thank you so much.